In the spring of 1291, the greatest army the Islamic world had ever assembled surrounded the final jewel of the Crusader kingdoms. And what followed was not just a siege, it was the end of 2 centuries of Christian rule in the Holy Land. The spring wind off the Mediterranean carried salt and smoke through the streets of Acre in March 1291. From the tallest tower of the citadel, a man could see across the packed rooftops to where Mamluk banners, black and yellow, countless as wheat stalks, surrounded the city on 3 sides. To the west lay only the sea, crowded now with Venetian and Genoese galleys, their crews already preparing for the evacuation that everyone knew must come. Acre was not supposed to fall. It had stood for a century, survived sieges before, grown fat on trade and pilgrimage. Its double walls were the most formidable in the Levant, its harbour the richest between Constantinople and Alexandria. Merchants from every corner of the known world walked its markets. Knights from the great military orders, Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights, garrisoned its towers. Acre was not just a city. It was the last Christian foothold in the Holy Land, the final ember of a crusading dream that had burned for 200 years. But the world had changed. The Mongol alliance had crumbled. The European kingdoms sent promises instead of armies. And now, approaching from the south and east, came Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil with a force that chroniclers would later estimate at 60,000 warriors, 200 siege engines, and the accumulated fury of a dynasty that had waited decades for this moment. The defenders numbered perhaps 15,000. Citizens, merchants, priests, women, children, and perhaps 7,000 fighting men scattered among the military orders and the city militia. They knew the mathematics of the siege. They knew what defeat would mean. They chose to stand anyway, behind walls that had never fallen, trusting in stone and God and the faint hope that help might come from across the sea. It would not. What happened in the spring and early summer of 1291 was not merely a battle. It was the final brutal erasure of the Crusader presence in Outremer, the land beyond the sea that generations of European knights had died to claim. When the walls of Acre fell, an entire era fell with them. This is the story of that ending. To understand why Acre mattered so desperately, you must first understand what it represented and what had already been lost. The Crusader States had been dying for decades, collapsing in slow motion like a tree rotting from within. Jerusalem itself, the jewel and purpose of the entire crusading enterprise, had fallen to Saladin's armies in 1187. The disaster at Hattin had shattered the military orders and the Crusader nobility. The Third Crusade, led by Richard the Lionheart, had reclaimed Acre and the coastal strip, but failed to retake the Holy City. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. For a century after Hattin, the Crusader states had limped along as a thin coastal fringe. Acre, Tyre, Sidon, smaller fortresses, and isolated castles. They survived through trade, through truces, through playing Muslim factions against each other, and through the occasional arrival of European reinforcements who rarely stayed long. The great dream of Christian dominion in the East had become a defensive holding action, a series of negotiations and compromises designed to preserve what little remained. Then came the Mamluks. Egypt's Ayyubid dynasty, founded by Saladin, had been overthrown in the 1250s by its own slave soldier Squaw caste. The Mamluks, fierce warriors trained from childhood, largely Turkic and Circassian in origin, forged into the deadliest cavalry in the Islamic world. Under Sultan Baybars, they had crushed the Mongol invasion at Ayn Jalut in 1260, a victory that sent shockwaves across the known world. With the Mongol threat neutralized, Baybars turned his attention westward to the Crusader remnants. Castle after castle fell. Caesarea, Arsuf, Safed, Antioch, each a wound, each a contraction of the shrinking Crusader realm. By the time Baybars died in 1277, the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem existed in name only, reduced to a few coastal cities clinging to survival. The Crusader nobility bickered among themselves. The military orders feuded over jurisdiction and pride. European reinforcements came in trickles, not floods. The kingdom was a body that had lost too much blood, kept upright by will and stubbornness alone. In 1289, Sultan Qalawun, Baybar's successor, captured Tripoli in a savage assault that left the city in ruins and its population slaughtered or enslaved. Only Acre remained, and even Acre knew its days were numbered. Then, in November 1290, Qalawun died suddenly while preparing to march on Acre. For a brief moment, the city breathed. But Qalawun's son, Al-Ashraf Khalil, was young, ambitious, and eager to prove himself worthy of his father's legacy. He did not hesitate. He gathered his father's army, expanded it, summoned every siege engine and military engineer in his realm, and in the spring of 1291, he marched north. The final act had begun. Acre sat on a peninsula jutting into the sea, its northern and eastern sides protected by massive double walls, and its western and southern flanks open to the Mediterranean. The outer wall stood 12 meters high in places, studded with towers every 50 paces. Behind it, separated by a killing ground, rose the inner wall, taller, thicker, anchored at key points by massive fortified towers controlled by the military orders. At the northern tip of the city stood the Tower of Flies, guarding the harbour entrance. Along the eastern wall stretched the Great Towers, the Accursed Tower, the Tower of the Legate, the English Tower, each garrisoned by different factions. The Templars held a fortified quarter in the southwest, a city within the city, with its own walls and tower. The Hospitallers controlled another district near the harbour. The Teutonic Knights held positions along the northern wall. Even the Venetian and Genoese merchant communities maintained their own fortified compounds, mini-kingdoms of commerce with their own militias. This fragmentation would be both Acre's strength and its curse. The military orders were legendary fighters, disciplined and fearless. But they did not always cooperate. They had their own chains of command, their own resources, their own pride. The Venetians and Genoese hated each other with a commercial rivalry that sometimes boiled into street violence. The city's nominal ruler, King Henry II of Cyprus, commanded respect but not absolute authority. Acre was less a unified city than a collection of fortified neighborhoods, each prepared to defend its own walls. When the Mamluk army appeared on the horizon in early April, the defenders took stock of what they had. Perhaps 1,500 Templar knights and sergeants, perhaps 1,000 Hospitallers, 500 Teutonic knights, a few hundred secular knights from Cyprus, and what remained of the Crusader nobility, several thousand infantry, crossbowmen, spearmen, and the city militia. Women and children and clergy swelled the total population to perhaps 40,000 souls crammed behind the walls. Against them came an army unlike any the Crusaders had faced. Al-Ashraf Khalil had summoned troops from Egypt, Syria, and beyond. Mamluks, Bedouins, Turks, infantry regiments from Damascus and Aleppo, engineers from across the Islamic world. Chroniclers writing in the decades after would claim the army numbered 60,000 warriors, perhaps 80,000, perhaps more. The numbers are uncertain, exaggerated by fear and legend. But this much is clear. The Mamluk army was immense, professional, and equipped with siege technology that would make the earlier Crusades look primitive by comparison. They brought 200 siege engines, massive trebuchets capable of hurling stones weighing hundreds of pounds, mangonels and catapults for sustained bombardment, rolling siege towers tall enough to overlook the walls, covered rams to batter the gates, engineers who understood counterweights and trajectories, who could calculate angles and distances, who had perfected the art of breaking stone. The defenders looked at the forest of tents and banners spreading across the plain and understood the arithmetic. They could not win a battle of attrition. Their hope lay in making the siege so costly, so bloody, that Al-Ashraf Khalil would accept a negotiated surrender, or that a relief force would arrive from Europe, or that the Sultan would be called away by internal rebellion or Mongol resurgence. None of those hopes would come true. On April 6, 1291, the Mamluk army completed its encirclement. The siege engines began their approach, and the bombardment began. The sound arrived first, a deep rhythmic thudding like the heartbeat of some monstrous beast. Then came the whistle of stones arcing through the air, dark shapes against the spring sky, and finally the crash as they struck the walls. The Mamluk trebuchets worked in shifts day and night, from positions arrayed in a vast semicircle around the city's northern and eastern faces. They did not aim for breaches, not yet. The opening phase of the siege was designed to terrorize, to wear down morale, to make sleep impossible. Stones fell on rooftops and markets. They shattered church towers. They crushed anyone caught in the open streets. The city became a place of constant, random death. At night, the Mamluks launched incendiary projectiles, clay pots filled with naphtha, and pitch that burst into flame on impact, turning wooden buildings into infernos. The defenders organized bucket brigades, but fires spread faster than they could be contained. Entire neighborhoods burned. The smoke hung over Acre like a shroud. The defenders responded as best they could. Crossbowmen on the walls shot at the siege engine crews, but the Mamluks built wooden screens and wicker mantlets to protect their engineers. The Crusaders had their own mangonels mounted on the towers, and they hurled stones back at the enemy positions, but they were outnumbered 10 to 1. For every Mamluk engine they destroyed, 2 more took its place. King Henry and the masters of the military orders held councils in the citadel, trying to coordinate defense across a city that did not naturally coordinate. The Templar Grand Master, William of Beaujeu, was a grizzled veteran who had survived decades in the East. He understood what was coming and urged discipline, rationing, and unity. The Hospitaller Master, Jean de Villiers, was equally experienced, but commanded a different order with its own priorities. The 2 men respected each other, but their troops answered to separate chains of command. As April turned to May, the bombardment intensified. The Mamluks began targeting specific sections of the wall, focusing their fire on the outer defenses near the accursed tower and the St. Anthony Gate. Stones weighing 300 pounds struck the same section of wall again and again, hour after hour, day after day. Cracks appeared, sections of parapet crumbled. The defenders worked frantically to shore up the damage with rubble and timber, but they were fighting physics. Stone will only endure so much punishment. By mid-May, the first sections of outer wall began to collapse. Not dramatic breaches, not yet, but sagging, crumbling stretches where the relentless bombardment had pulverized the mortar and fractured the blocks. The Mamluks saw the cracks spreading and intensified their fire. The defenders knew what came next. Once a practicable breach opened in the outer wall, the assault would begin, waves of infantry storming the gap while the trebuchets shifted fire to the inner wall. The only question was whether the Crusaders could hold the breaches long enough to make the cost unbearable. On the night of May 14th, a section of the outer wall near the accursed tower collapsed entirely, spilling rubble into the killing ground between the outer and inner defenses. The Mamluks did not attack immediately. They waited, knowing the defenders would be exhausted from weeks of bombardment, and when dawn broke on May 15th, they sounded the horns. The first assault had begun. They came in the grey light before sunrise, thousands of Mamluk infantry surging toward the breach, their war cries echoing off the battered walls. The Crusader crossbowmen on the inner wall opened fire, bolts hissing through the dawn air, dropping men in mid-stride. Archers behind the assault waves shot back, forcing the defenders to duck behind crenellations. The Mamluks reached the rubble of the collapsed outer wall and began scrambling over it, shields raised against the rain of bolts. The killing ground between the walls became a slaughterhouse. Crusader mangonels launched stones into the packed mass of attackers. Defenders dropped rocks and burning pitch from the inner wall. Men screamed. Men fell. Men kept coming. The Templars and Hospitallers had positioned their best troops at the breaches, knowing this was where the battle would be won or lost. Knights in full armor, shields locked, swords ready, stood at the base of the inner wall where the Mamluks would have to climb. Behind them, sergeants and infantry formed a second line. Above them, crossbowmen reloaded and fired as fast as their hands could move. The first Mamluk warriors to reach the inner wall carried scaling ladders, long crude things that took 4 men to carry. They slammed them against the stone and began to climb, even as defenders shoved the ladders back or poured boiling water down on the climbers. Some ladders held. Some attackers reached the top of the wall only to be cut down by waiting knights. A few actually made it onto the parapet before being overwhelmed. For 3 hours the assault continued. Wave after wave of Mamluk infantry threw themselves at the breach, and wave after wave broke against the disciplined resistance of the military orders. Bodies piled in the killing ground. The rubble of the outer wall became slick with blood. The air filled with the sound of metal on metal, the screams of the dying, the roar of the Mamluk war cries, and the defiant shouts of the Crusaders. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the assault stopped. Horns blew. The Mamluks withdrew, dragging their wounded, leaving their dead. The defenders gasped for breath, drank water, checked their wounds. They had held, but they knew this was only the beginning. For the next 2 weeks, the pattern repeated. The Mamluks launched assaults at different points along the walls, probing for weakness, forcing the defenders to spread their limited forces thin. Sometimes the attacks came at dawn, sometimes at midday, sometimes in the dead of night, when exhausted men were jolted awake by the sudden roar of war, drums, and the rush of feet on stone. The trebuchets never stopped. Even when no assault was underway, stones fell on the city, grinding away at morale, at sleep, at hope. Sections of the inner wall began to show damage. The defenders could not repair everything. They had to choose which towers to reinforce, which stretches of wall to shore up, which breaches to defend, and which to abandon. By the end of May, the Crusaders had lost the outer wall entirely. The Mamluks controlled the killing ground and were beginning to undermine sections of the inner wall, digging tunnels beneath the foundations and propping them up with timbers that would be burned when the time came, collapsing the wall from below. Inside the city, desperation set in. Food was running low, water was rationed. The constant bombardment had destroyed whole neighborhoods. Refugees from the outer districts crowded into the fortified quarters, sleeping in churches and courtyards. Disease began to spread. Dysentery, fevers, infections from untreated wounds. King Henry sent messengers to Cyprus. begging for reinforcements. None came. The Venetian and Genoese captains prepared their ships for evacuation, negotiating fares with those wealthy enough to pay. The poor knew they would be left behind. In the council chambers, the masters of the military orders debated options. Should they attempt a breakout? Should they negotiate surrender? William of Beaujeu argued for fighting to the last man, not out of suicidal pride, but because he knew Al-Ashraf Khalil would offer no terms that preserved Acre as a Christian city. Surrender meant slavery or death. Better to die with swords in hand. On the evening of May 17th, the Mamluks lit fires along their siege lines, visible from every tower in Acre. It was a message. The final assault was coming. The morning of May 18th, 1291, dawned hot and clear. The bombardment, which had been constant for 6 weeks, suddenly ceased. An eerie silence fell over Acre, broken only by the murmur of the sea and the distant sound of Mamluk drums. The defenders knew what the silence meant. The assault would come not in waves, but as a single, overwhelming flood designed to shatter the defense through sheer mass. Every available Mamluk warrior would attack at once on every section of wall, making it impossible for the Crusaders to concentrate their forces. Around midday, the drums changed rhythm, faster, sharper. Building to a crescendo, then the horns sounded, a long, mournful wail that echoed across the plain, and the Mamluk army surged forward. Thousands of infantry, shoulder to shoulder, carrying ladders and grappling hooks, rushed the walls. Behind them came engineers with covered rams aimed at the gates. Behind them, Mamluk cavalry waited for the moment when the walls would be breached and they could pour into the streets. The defenders unleashed everything they had: crossbows, bows, mangonels, rocks, boiling water, burning oil. The air became a storm of projectiles. Men fell by the dozens, by the hundreds, and still the Mamluks came on, climbing over their own dead, throwing ladders against walls already bristling with ladders, ascending in a human tide that no amount of killing could stop. At the St. Anthony Gate, a Mamluk ram broke through the outer doors. Crusader infantry formed a shield wall behind the gate, fighting in the narrow passage, holding the breach for an hour, then 2, their ranks thinning with every minute. When the Mamluks finally broke through, they found themselves in a street packed with defenders who fought them building by building, room by room. At the accursed tower, Mamluk sappers set fire to the timbers, supporting a section of undermined wall. The ground shook. The tower swayed. Then, with a roar like thunder, it collapsed, crushing dozens of defenders and opening a massive breach in the inner wall. Mamluk warriors poured through the gap, screaming victory, and met the Templar Knights waiting in the rubble. What followed was not a battle. It was a massacre on both sides. The Templars, outnumbered 20 to 1, fought with the fury of men who knew they would not leave the breach alive. Every knight who fell was replaced by a sergeant. Every sergeant who fell was replaced by a common soldier. The breach became a charnel house, a place where men waded through blood and corpses to reach the enemy. William of Beaujeu, the Templar Grand Master, fought at the head of his knights. He took an arrow to the chest, but did not fall. He pulled it out, kept fighting, and took another arrow to the throat. This time he fell, and the Templars closed ranks over his body, fighting on even as their master died. Jean de Villiers, the Hospitaller master, was wounded by a spear thrust that pierced his armor. His men carried him from the walls, but the loss of both Grand Masters within an hour shattered the already fragile command structure. By late afternoon, the Mamluks controlled multiple breaches. They fought their way into the northern districts, They took the St. Anthony Gate. They pushed westward toward the harbour, cutting the city in half. The evacuation began in chaos. Venetian and Genoese ships crowded the harbour, their decks packed with screaming refugees. Captains demanded exorbitant fees. Women threw jewellery and coin at sailors, begging to be taken aboard. Children were separated from parents. Men fought each other for places on boats. Some ships capsized from overcrowding. Others pulled away half empty because their captains feared Mamluk archers on the walls. King Henry of Cyprus made it to a ship with a handful of nobles. The Hospitaller master, wounded and bleeding, was carried aboard a galley by his knights. Most of the Templars refused to evacuate, retreating instead to their fortified compound in the southwest corner of the city. They would make their last stand there. As night fell on May 18th, most of Acre was in Mamluk hands. Fires raged unchecked. The streets ran with blood. Thousands of Crusaders and civilians were already dead. Thousands more were trapped, hiding in churches and cellars, waiting for the inevitable. The Mamluks did not wait. They moved through the city in disciplined units, killing any man found with weapons, enslaving women and children, looting houses and churches. Priests were dragged from altars and butchered. Nuns were taken as captives. The sick and the elderly, too weak to flee, were left where they lay to die in the fires. By dawn on May 19th, the only Christian position left in Acre was the Templar fortress, a massive compound with its own walls and tower, now surrounded and cut off from any hope of relief or escape. The Templar compound occupied the southwest corner of Acre, jutting into the sea. Its walls were thick, its tower tall, and it had its own water supply and food stores. Perhaps 500 Templars and 2,000 civilians, refugees who had fled there when the rest of the city fell, were crammed inside. They knew they could not hold forever, but they could hold long enough to negotiate. Or so they hoped. On May 20th, Mamluk envoys approached under a flag of truce. They offered terms. The Templars could evacuate by sea, taking with them their weapons and whatever they could carry. In exchange, they would surrender the fortress intact and allow the Mamluks to enter peacefully. The Templar Marshal, Peter de Sèvres, now the senior officer after William of Beaujeu's death, debated with his brothers. Some argued for accepting the terms. The order could regroup in Cyprus, rebuild, return another day. Others argued that the Mamluks had never honored a surrender in living memory, that accepting the terms meant walking into a trap. In the end, necessity won. The civilians needed to leave. The wounded needed to leave. Peter de Sèvres agreed to the terms. On May 25th, the gates of the Templar fortress opened. A delegation of unarmed Templars met the Mamluk commanders. The evacuation would begin at dawn the next day. But when the Mamluk troops entered the fortress on May 26th, they did not come to escort refugees. They came to loot and enslave. Soldiers rushed through the compound, seizing women and boys. When a group of Templars tried to stop them, the Mamluks turned on them with swords. The truce collapsed in seconds. The Templars slammed the gates shut, trapping several hundred Mamluk soldiers inside. In the confined courtyards and passageways of the fortress, a brutal melee erupted. The Templars, enraged and betrayed, killed every Mamluk they could reach. The survivors retreated to the central tower, the final redoubt, barricading the doors. Al-Ashraf Khalil, furious at the loss of his men, ordered the tower destroyed. Sappers dug beneath the foundations. On May 28th, they set fire to the support timbers. The tower held for hours, groaning and cracking. Then, with a roar that could be heard across the water in Cyprus, the tower of the temple collapsed. It fell inward, crushing the Templars inside. crushing the Mamluk sappers who had been working at its base, burying friend and foe alike under tons of stone. When the dust settled, there was no tower, there were no Templars, there was only rubble and silence. The siege of Acre was over. The last stronghold of the Crusader States had fallen. Al-Ashraf Khalil spent the next month erasing Acre from existence. His engineers systematically demolished what the siege had left standing. The great walls were torn down stone by stone. The harbour was filled with rubble to prevent any future landing. Churches were levelled. The markets that had once buzzed with trade from 3 continents were ground into dust. It was not enough to defeat Acre. The Sultan wanted to ensure it could never again serve as a foothold for Christian invasion. He wanted the destruction to be so complete that future crusaders would find nothing to reclaim. Prisoners were sorted, the wealthy were ransomed, the able-bodied were marched to slave markets in Cairo and Damascus, the old and the sick were left to die. Chroniclers differ on the numbers, but estimates suggest that tens of thousands of Acre's population died in the siege and its aftermath, killed in battle, burned in fires, executed after capture, or succumbing to wounds and disease in the days that followed. The handful of crusaders who escaped to Cyprus brought tales of horror that shocked even a Europe grown accustomed to bad news from the East. King Henry wept when he heard of the city's fall. Pope Nicholas IV called for a new crusade, but his call met with indifference. Europe was exhausted. The great age of crusading fervour was over. The military orders, shattered by the loss of their grand masters, and hundreds of knights, withdrew to Cyprus to regroup. The Templars, traumatized by the betrayal at their fortress, would within 2 decades be destroyed entirely by King Philip IV of France. Their wealth seized, their leaders burned at the stake on fabricated charges. The Hospitallers would eventually relocate to Rhodes and then Malta, transforming into a maritime power. The Teutonic Knights would shift their focus to the Baltic, conquering pagan lands far from the deserts of Outremer. But none would ever return to the Holy Land in force. The brief, bloody, doomed experiment of the Crusader States, 2 centuries of knights and castles and kingdoms carved from the edge of the Islamic world, ended in the rubble of Acre. The fall of the city sent a shockwave through Christendom. For generations, pilgrimage to Jerusalem had been the ultimate act of piety, and the existence of Christian kingdoms in the East had made it possible, however dangerous. Now the door was closed. The Holy Land was unreachable, held by powers that would not tolerate a Christian presence. The psychological impact was profound. The Crusades had been justified, preached, and fought as God's will. The recovery of Christian holy sites from infidel hands. The loss of Jerusalem in 1187 had been a wound. The loss of Acre in 1291 was an amputation. It forced a reckoning. Had God abandoned Christendom? Had the sins of the Crusaders, their greed, their cruelty, their internal feuds, doomed the enterprise? Some chroniclers blamed the merchant republics for prioritizing profit over piety. Others blamed the military orders for their pride. Still, others blamed the European kings for failing to send enough reinforcements. But the truth was simpler and harsher. The Crusader States had survived as long as they did through luck, division among their enemies, and temporary alliances. When those factors vanished, when a unified and competent Islamic power focused its full attention on eradicating them, they had no answer. The Mamluks did not stop at Acre. Within weeks, the remaining Crusader fortresses along the coast, Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, were abandoned or surrendered. By the end of summer 1291, there was no Christian presence left in Outremer. The dream that had begun with Pope Urban VI's sermon in 1095, that had sent hundreds of thousands of men eastward, that had created kingdoms and spawned legends, was over. In the centuries that followed, Acre became a ghost in European memory, a cautionary tale, a symbol of failed ambition, a place where God's will had somehow gone awry. Medieval chronicles described the siege in apocalyptic terms, as if the fall of the city had been a cosmic event, a sign of the world's decline. But the fall of Acre was not apocalyptic. It was the predictable result of unsustainable political, military, and demographic realities. The Crusader States were always colonies, dependent on a steady flow of reinforcements and resources from Europe. When that flow dwindled to a trickle, when the Italian merchant cities grew more interested in trade deals than territorial defense, when internal feuds paralyzed decision-making, collapse was inevitable. The Mamluks, by contrast, were united, professional, and fighting on their own terrain. They had learned from decades of conflict with the Crusaders. They understood siege warfare. They had the resources of Egypt and Syria behind them. Al-Ashraf Khalil did not need to be a military genius to take Acre. He simply needed to be competent and patient. And yet, the defenders of Acre fought with a courage that even their enemies acknowledged. The Templars and Hospitallers held breaches against overwhelming odds. William of Beaujeu died with a sword in his hand. The civilian population endured weeks of bombardment rather than surrender. They fought because they believed, rightly or wrongly, that they were defending something larger than themselves. A kingdom, a faith, a way of life that had endured for 200 years. When the last tower fell, it took with it not just stone and mortar, but the living memory of generations. The children born in Acre, who had never seen Europe. The merchants who had traded in Arabic and French and Italian. The priests who had tended churches built on the ruins of mosques, built on the ruins of churches. All of it, erased in 6 weeks of fire and blood. The battlefield itself disappeared within a generation. Al-Ashraf Khalil's demolition was so thorough that later travelers to the site struggled to identify where the walls had stood. Acre would be rebuilt centuries later by Ottomans and then by Crusader descendants. But it was never again the city it had been in 1291. What remains are the chronicles, written by men who survived the siege or heard tales from those who did. They disagree on numbers, on the sequence of events, on who was to blame. But they agree on the scale of the catastrophe. They agree that the defenders fought bravely. And they agree that when Acre fell, something irreplaceable was lost. For the Crusaders, Acre was the end of a dream that had begun with visions of holy war and ended in the practical reality of siege engines and mathematics. For the Mamluks, it was the culmination of decades of effort to expel the Frankish invaders and secure their borders. For the people of Acre, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish merchants who had lived side by side in the cosmopolitan city, it was a personal apocalypse, the destruction of their homes and livelihoods. And for history, Acre is a reminder that empires, kingdoms, and dreams are fragile things. That courage is not always enough. That walls, no matter how thick, will crumble under sustained assault. And that the echoes of desperate battles fought long ago still linger in the stones and the stories, waiting for anyone willing to listen. When the Sultan's engineers finished their work and departed, leaving behind a field of rubble where a city had stood, the wind from the sea carried the silence across the empty plain. It was the silence of endings. The silence of doors closing. The silence that falls when a long, bitter chapter finally reaches its last page. 200 years of Crusader history ended not with a sudden catastrophe, but with a grinding, inevitable siege. It ended with knights fighting to the last in collapsing towers. It ended with civilians drowning as overloaded ships capsized in the harbor. It ended with the crack of stone, and the roar of flames, and the cries of the enslaved being marched away in chains. The Holy Land would never again be a Crusader kingdom. The military orders would never again hold castles in Outremer. Jerusalem would remain beyond the reach of Christian armies for centuries to come. The siege of Acre was not just the fall of a city. It was the death of an era, written in blood and rubble, remembered in sorrow and bitter argument, and echoing still through the long corridors of history.